All right, so we're just waiting on some of these teams to get themselves ready. And again, some great MDI veterans on both sides coming together here to face off and see who is going to be moving into that upper bracket and who gets dropped down to the lower to start tomorrow's series. So going into it, Mr. Tyrannicide between Obey Alliance and PI Me.
Are you ready for this, Dranos?
Yeah, these beautiful shots of the dungeon. This is one of the great looking dungeons, especially that first bit. Then that wall of mist goes down after the second boss, and it's all like desecrated. You get really angry at the Gorm for doing that. The Ardenweald storyline, almost as impressive as this first pull that we see coming out from both teams. You can see PI Me opting for a slightly slower strategy of paralyzing the inspiring mob just outside of the pull, whereas Obey Alliance going bigger here. They are pulling that mob into the rest of this pack. It means they won't be able to do any interrupts to any other mobs, but they've decided they can get through it, as actually we have quite a bit of difference here in composition between these teams, with the Balanced Druid and the Unholy Death Knight on the side of Obey Alliance. The Unholy Death Knight doing quite a bit of damage to this pull, whereas on the side of PI Me, there's the Windwalker Monk and the Marksmanship Hunter instead.
Yeah, it looks like Obey Alliance is even leaning further into that strategy we saw from Golden Guardians in the previous series, where they're just going for the full one phase on the first boss and hoping that'll give them enough of an advantage overall in the dungeon to where their on-demand AoE burst in the mist phase isn't going to be as necessary in order to compete. And, if it's done properly, it'll probably give them about a minute to a minute and a half advantage. So I like the idea from them, but like we saw from Golden Guardians, it didn't really work out for them. So we're going to have to see some play from Obey Alliance to see if they can pull that off. PI Me already onto the double Bowbreaker pull. Looks like they're just cruising through the dungeon so far.
Yeah, they've decided to skip that 4-pack just prior to this pull. Or maybe they're going to go and back pull into it. Yes, that is going to be the operation here. So that's going to be nice for them. The mobs that they pulled first, those Bowbreakers, have more health than the others as well. So as long as they can avoid the Soul Cleaver healing too much when it buffs itself, and swings every auto attack will leech health back onto it, this should be a fairly efficient way to do this pull. They have that inspiring mob crowd controlled. They'll be spawning Pride, and we'll see what sequence they decide to do. The Prideful mob, the boss, and the inspiring mob. Presumably you want to combine those in some way, but you don't want to be fighting all three at the same time.
Looks like Obey Alliance has gone through something similar here as well, where they pulled the last inspiring mob up into the double Bowbreakers as well, just so they didn't have to worry about interrupts on the previous 4-pack by just killing 3 of the mobs without the inspiring mobs. And it actually has pulled out, gone a little bit better for them here. They're on the Prideful before PI Me is.
Yeah, it looks like PI Me is going to be melding the Pride. So they've decided, all right, look, we aren't going to be one-phasing this boss, right? We're just going to, we're going to do this in 2 clean phases, and we're going to get the benefit of not killing a Prideful mob, which does save quite a bit of time if you don't end up needing or using its buff. So perhaps the burst in their comp is going to allow them to make that, a clean 2-phase without Pride, right?
I mean, it definitely should, and I haven't quite paid attention to the Hunter here as well, but if he's running that Carrion, it means he'll have burst phases for both of each of the phases with that Carrion ability, the Resonating Arrow.
It looks like their Hunter is actually playing Night Phase, so has access to Wild Spirits
he is
instead.
playing Night Phase, you can see that on the damage meter, yeah. So yeah, it's pretty much all going to come down to whether or not Obey Alliance can actually get that full-on 1-phase here. That'll be very indicative of how they're going to be able to compete in this dungeon.
I gotta say, I've been loving watching the different Covenant choices that teams have been coming up with for these different specs. This is the second Hunter Covenant we've seen. We've seen different specs for Death Knight, for Vengeance Demon Hunter, for Discipline Priest. All those different specs have had different Covenants played. Even the Moonkin, basically every single spec so far, except for the Fire Mage, which has pretty consistently been Night Fae for that shifting power. So strong for that spec, especially in a speedrunning setting like this. And the Windwalker Monks for the Weapons of Order, massive burst damage that Kyrian offers. But other than that, we've been seeing a lot of different swaps being made as these teams see fit, either dungeon by dungeon or just what a player thinks might be better overall. And the players have been disagreeing about that. And I always think it's very interesting when players disagree about what the best choices are.
Here comes the burst phase for Obey Alliance here. Very important that they can get this down. They have both the CA and the Convoke the Spirits coming from the Druid, as well as the Army of the Dead and the Combust from the Mage here. And this boss is getting destroyed. The full-on 1-phase, 3% left after the damage amp. That's what the comp is for right there. And you can see PI Me only got the boss to like high 60s in their first phase. They might have to go through 2 extra phases now, whereas Obey Alliance just gets to move on with the rest of the dungeon.
Yeah, so PI Me avoided fighting a Pride, and that was cool. That saved him a little bit of time. But Obey Alliance used that Pride instead with all their cooldowns, every single thing you could possibly imagine, the burstiest comp you could come up with, perhaps. Well, a very bursty comp, particularly on single target with the Moonkin Convoke, and all of that lined up to save them minutes, I'd say here, at least a minute on that boss. So that must be worthwhile, I think.
Well, if Piami is able to get the boss down in the second phase, it shouldn't be too big of a time loss for them. And with it being below 10%, they'll easily be able to burn Ingram Malak without having to deal with the tree once again. But still, the time saved from being able to one phase that boss can't be mentioned enough. They're already done with the first pack here, when Piami hasn't even gotten through the first mist to get to the first pack.
Yeah, they're able to get through that first door in the maze. A little tip for those who don't know, the first door you don't even have to do the little puzzle for. It'll just always be whichever one Mistcaller runs through at the start of that event. So if you're paying attention, you can just know what it's going to be and then not even have to worry about solving that first puzzle. Although, of course, it's good practice to learn how to do that puzzle on one of the earlier moments where it's a little bit less punishing if you do mess it up.
Right, for sure. Actually, like you mentioned, you can get through the first two doors, so people need to pay attention to where that Dreamweaver is going. So, second pack now going down for Obey Alliance here, and you can see, again, the power of the Mage having Combust available for pretty much every single pull. It's why we're seeing it in pretty much every team comp. And like we mentioned earlier, that shifting power, making sure you can get your Combust cooldown down to about 1 minute, just makes them so useful in general for everything. And the PI helps with that as well. Hence the name PI me over on the side of Dr. J's team, because I'm pretty sure Dr. J is going to be the one getting those PIs.
Yes, the power infusion, the haste from that, it usually doesn't reduce the cooldown of your combustion that much, right? Because you're not throwing off too many fireballs during a usual AoE combust, right? But it's still not bad, and if you do use it, it can help set up the combust being on that 1 minute timer, right? Being on the 1 minute timer is much better than being on a slightly longer timer, so you can line every single PI up with a combust, ideally.
Now, something that can be done here for most teams, and we're not really seeing it in these mist runs yet, or we haven't seen it yet today, but you can only go through these doors when you're out of combat, and there is a brief time period in between a pack dies and the Pride spawns that you can actually go through the mist, and you can maybe pull the Prideful into the next pack if you have the cooldowns. They didn't opt to go for it here, and I think they might have been able to, since you can see they have the Celestial Alignment and likely the Convoke up from their Druid here, who has just decided to pop it to deal with the Prideful. But it looks like they're just going to go ahead and deal with it that way, and then they have Combust available for the next pull, so just good cooldown allocation. I feel like ideally you'd be able to cleave that down with this pack if you can get the out-of-combat mist.
You don't even need to do it out of... Like, you could actually meld the Pride. I think we've seen that actually in earlier
yeah, you can do that
You
too.
meld the Pride, pop through, and then you can pull the Pride in as well if you feel like the pack is going to be easy, and then you get the Pride buff for whatever comes next. As you can see, wow, this maze is being solved very, very effectively by Obey Alliance here.
Oh yeah, and then everyone's favorite trash mob in this dungeon, the Gorge Gullet. Big old frog that hops around and slows your tank by 1,000,000%. It's a good old mob. All you gotta do is dodge the leaps, and it's pretty easy. Just a big chunk of HP to get through, and this is usually the kind of mob where having a Boomkin Convoke available is really useful, like especially in live pushing keys, but obviously that was just used on the Prideful, so they're just gonna have to slowly get through this. Looks like the DK committed his cooldowns to this one.
Yeah, this DK is playing Venthyr as well, so not the Necrolord that DKs generally play on the live servers, instead playing Venthyr, which I think makes a lot of sense. We've actually seen both, though, over the course of this tournament so far today, seeing play the Necrolord as well. Venthyr giving them that Swarming Mist, which is a pretty potent, you can see it being used right now by 40 DK, pretty potent AoE cooldown.
Yeah, for sure. And then once again, I mean, you can just see that the cooldown allocation is pretty much perfect here. You have the Mage Combust available for just about every other pull. Then you usually have, the DK with his Dark Transformation and, probably the Venthyr ability just for another pull. And then any sort of single target burst, you always have your cooldowns from your Druid, your Convoke, and your Celestial Alignment available for. Although they aren't available this time, so this Prideful might last quite a bit for Obey Alliance, unless they just plan on Shadow Melding it off, which it looks like Skywalker's pulling it in the corner for them to do.
It does seem to be the case, yeah, that he was getting ready to do that, and the rest of the group made it through the door, and then are they going to pull the Pride with Mistcaller, or are they going to just leave it? I think they're just going to leave it. It's possible you could fight a Prideful with this boss, and if you were just cleaving it down, you might be able to benefit a little bit damage-wise there, but there's a tremendous amount of AoE damage that comes out when you're fighting a Pride, particularly if you don't focus it down. That makes it very scary to have it be a secondary target in a situation where you're not committing a lot of cooldowns that naturally cleave it down.
Right, and the thing about this boss as well on Tyrannicals is just going to end up taking a long time, but it's going to take even more time for them because, as you can see from the cooldowns up at the top of the screen, the only real major cooldown they'll have coming up here in the next minute or so is going to be that Mage Combust. That's it.
Their Mage pre-combustion sitting in 5th place on the damage meters behind both the healer and the tank. Really a brutal spot to be in. It looks like just saving that combustion for the first ad target here, if I had to guess. As they quickly identify which one the correct target will be, and there goes the combustion as soon as the determination is made on which they do need to target.
Now, I wonder if we're going to see Chompy saving his Convoke and Celestial Alignment to try to skip that final guessing game phase. That would be the most obvious use of it, I think. It saves an entire intermission phase, probably about 20 seconds.
I don't know how feasible it is to burn 10% of the boss's health on a Tyrannical 18, but yeah, if possible, it does seem like it. I mean, it would definitely be worthwhile. It'd be worth saving cooldowns to do that. But it looks like the Convoke is going to be fired off right now, so I don't think that is going to be the plan here for Obey Alliance. Meanwhile, PI May also doing very well here. Also on Mistcaller, they have a little bit more mob count, although it's worth noting that the mob count is sometimes a little bit off in this dungeon. On our tournament realms, sometimes the Tiernan villagers aren't correctly giving the 2.5% count that they should be when they're dying. So we're tracking that, and we'll make sure that the dungeon is finished as appropriate at the end of the run, even if it doesn't quite say 100%. But it does mean that maybe the count here is potentially even closer than the 8% difference that you can see on screen right now.
Yeah, one of the things you'll notice as well about this boss is that neither team is really ever worrying about dealing with the illusionary Vulpine that fixates players. If you disorient or permanently CC it, it's never something you have to worry about. So both groups have a Fire Mage in the group that can Dragon's Breath it every single time it spawns. And if you interrupt that freeze tag's fixation cast that it does, it will never freeze anyone. So that's why you're not seeing either of these teams have any major issue with it.
Yeah, that is definitely a much easier thing to deal with, particularly if your group is full of melee. Because normally if your group is full of melee, then you kind of have to all kite. You can't just have one person kite it, because that person would be losing damage if they were melee. It also does a big AoE freeze if it does successfully connect with its target, and that can, I mean, it can be a group wiping thing if that does happen. So a very important mechanic to take care of. Also an important mechanic to not lose too many globals too, though. Let's see if they decide that they want to mount up and slow fall this. That's something that we've seen other teams do to get past this first 3-pack. There's a little bit of an invisible wall that you can slow fall against if you decide to go that way. Looks like that's not going to be the plan here for Obey Alliance. They are going to just jump down, and they will be either pulling or skipping this pack through other means.
Yeah, likely just prisoning from Skylark there. There it is, comes out now, and they're set up for this massive pull that we see a lot of teams do, even on live servers where you pull both that left and right pack together, let it all come together in the middle, and then your mage just kind of shoots to the moon.
Yeah, this pull, very scary if it lives a long time, but they have the tools available to make sure it doesn't with the combustion, and especially with the Death Knight as well, in Swarming Mist, with Dark Transformation up, that can also be extremely effective at killing those higher health ones towards the end of the pull, which this pack, not all the mobs in this pack have the same amount of health. There will be some that survive quite a bit longer than the others.
This pull definitely taking a little longer to round up than normal, but I think they actually ended up pulling that 3rd pack in the back, so with everything now stacked together, you can see the DK and the Mage will be shooting up pretty quickly here. Looks like the DK got most of the pie on the small ads, but the Fire Mage damage coming in hot later on, no pun intended. And I mean, you can already see his Combust is almost off cooldown again because of that cooldown reduction from Shifting Power. It's kind of nutty what that class can do with uncapped AoE.
Yeah, the power infusion as well, just so strong in a setting like this, as the appropriately named PI Me, Power Infusion team, making their way also down to this pull. Let's see if they're potentially able to also pull this off in nearly as fast of a fashion as Obey Alliance begin work on this Prideful. They are just going to kill this Prideful, honestly, the old-fashioned way, in an ethical fashion, even one might say, whereas other teams have sometimes opted to skip these Prides. I think this one, though, that'll allow them to pull another 2-pack in combination, which would be quite, I mean, almost all the rest of the count they need.
Well, I wouldn't be surprised here as well to see what we saw from Golden Guardians, where they actually pull these next 2 packs into the Boss with Lust, which they have available. And it looks like they have, well, they don't have their cooldowns and their Moonkin and their DK up, but I mean, you kind of don't need those when you have a Fire Mage in your group. You have Pride, you have Combust, you have Lust, that's all you need. And we'll see if Skylark plans on going forward. Looks like he is. He's going straight into the boss room. So here you go. Double pack with the boss, and with really only a mage combust to do damage with. Gonna be a little scary for them for sure.
Here is Skylark getting pummeled. Fell Devastation, though, will turn him into a demon for 6 seconds. During that time, he will be very hard to kill. They need to make sure that these mobs die, ideally before he does. Looks like Last Resort is still available, though, so that he's actually a lot safer than his health bar looks here. Because if he ever would die, he instead turns into a demon for another 15 seconds, and that makes him, again, extremely, extremely tanky. It is night and day how different tanking feels on Demon Hunter when you have versus don't have Last Resort available as a safety net against getting killed.
Oh man, I can tell every single time Evade loses his Last Resort buff, he's a completely different man for the next 8 minutes. But that being said, the trash easily goes down, and I mean, the DK and the Moonkin, even though they didn't have cooldowns, were pretty easily able to keep up somewhat with the Fire Mage, so pretty impressive to see that uncapped AoE coming out from both of them as well. And now they only have half of the boss's HP left on Tyrannical, and then maybe a couple packs afterwards to finish off the dungeon. Piami definitely still a little bit behind, but they're going for a similar pull with what I think is the rest of the trash they need into the boss, and they also have their Bloodlust available, so it's going to be pretty close here at the end.
This is going to be very, very close. Tredova's still at 50%. That boss's health bar barely moving for Obey Alliance here. Whereas for Piami, if they can take care of all this trash under Tredova, they will potentially be done with their trash count and not need to do an extra pull after the dungeon is over, which Obey Alliance certainly will have to do. So this dungeon, the two teams have come about it at a different way, but they're going to reach their destinations at right around the same time. This is going to be a very, very close finish.
Oh yeah, for sure. Now, one of the issues as well is that Dr. didn't have his Combust up available for the beginning of this AoE pull, so not really going to be making up any ground there. But it would be a little awkward if the Prideful did proc here, right? Because that means you have to deal with the Prideful during the boss, so I don't think it's going to proc for them here. They'll probably go to 99%, and they'll proc it when the boss is about to go down, right?
Well, I think that they are at 98%, but they have killed a Tiernan Villager that's worth 2.6%. Which I think means that they are actually at 100% in terms of the dungeon. That slight bug with how Tiernan villagers are counted on the tournament realm is something that we only became aware of pretty recently, so we decided to resolve it in this way. And that means that they'll be able to finish this dungeon as soon as that boss does die on their screen, whereas Obey Alliance need to get to either 95 or 97 or 100%, depending on how many of those villagers they've killed in that way.
Yeah, both groups killed 2 villagers at the start of the dungeon, so they will require the same count, roughly 90, a little below 98% trash needed here. So probably go for a double pull here. They have the Mage Combust available, and that's really it. Although the Unholy DK and Boomkin do pump out enough AoE damage to do enough to help out.
I think it's 95% is the number we're looking for if they've killed 2 Tiernan villagers. So this pull versus the boss's health, I believe, is what we are looking for to determine who is going to win this game between these two. We have is that okay? Yeah, there's difficulty going on here.
You can see Igloo's for Piami over there. Looks like he just went down and had to get battle res, but that's going to be the end of the dungeon here. Obey Alliance getting to 100% of the trash, a little more than they needed, but taking a pretty quick, pretty impressive run, especially comparing the time to the previous runs that we saw. That was about 3 minutes faster than what we saw from the other 2 teams that ran Mists earlier today.
Yeah, Obey Alliance coming out and being extremely impressive there with their Mist of Tyrannicide run, taking game number 1, and like I said, pretty decisive faction, although we did see Piami keeping it very close. It's just been kind of the continuing trend a lot of times with these competitors here, Tettles.
Yeah, I mean, the 3rd seed versus the 6th seed, but that really, again, we've talked about how close the competition is straight across the board amongst all teams. And they proved that here today. The 3rd seed versus the 6th seed, that Mist of Tyrannicide was within, I don't even know, like 15, 30 seconds. To where it definitely is something that is difficult to deal with, Jack.
Yeah, and one of the biggest things is just looking at how these competitors are starting to stack up for each other in a situation where Dranos, we have a lot of different routes and some alterations that are coming in for these teams as everybody is giving their first impressions, really, of their dungeons before they start kind of yoinking other people's strategies and looking at different strats that they can take advantage of.
Yeah, this first cup of the whole expansion is one of the most exciting for seeing these different paths that the teams have come up with before they have an idea of what the other teams are up to. Of course, there's some amount of shared knowledge already. There's been a lot of keys done on live. There's been a lot of these players have played with each other in different practice and beta settings. But this first round of practice, round of theory in each dungeon, coming up with a path, is done without a lot of knowledge of what the other teams are up to, and that leads to a lot of differences between the teams. In a dungeon like Mistcaller Scythe, that led to some small but decisive differences between these teams. In a dungeon like The Other Side, which is where we're going next, there's a lot more optionality. There's 3 different wings that you can attack in several different orders, perhaps. Generally on the live keys, we've seen Hakar, then the Mana Storms, and then Dealer Xy'exa, but perhaps we'll see a different strategy with the teams here. There's maybe other ways that you can time your Bloodlusts, your Pridefuls, your Shadow Meld skips to take advantage of different pathing throughout the dungeon. There's opportunities to U-turn. We see teams turn around for Pride timing in dungeons like this, in this dungeon in Theater of Pain on the live servers. Is that going to be something that teams do in the MDI, or are they instead going to find ways to keep the pathing such that they never have to backtrack? Because theoretically, that's also a time loss.
Yeah, and before we get into the other side and some of that different routing potential, let's talk about some of the small differences that we saw in Mist's here titles.
I think the biggest one is composition. Like, oh my goodness. Okay, so Nagur and I were talking about the Moonkin last time, and we talked about the differences in the first boss and like how it speeds up your dungeon versus slows down your dungeon. So on the team PI me, they do meld off this Pride, which seems really, really good for them and seems really good for their comp. Whereas on the side of Obey Alliance, they are pulling this Pride, playing it, but then they're melding it off at 5% HP, so they're able to pull it into the bottom little bit of the boss, get an advantageous Pride timing, and they get an even more advantageous Bloodlust timing. This allows them to then burn the boss whenever it gets the damage increase, and burn it all the way from 100 to like 5% whenever the increase is active, and then they're able to like very quickly finish off the boss. This saves them probably the most time in the dungeon over the other composition. And while I don't think Moonkin is like that great in this dungeon, I do think that this is exactly what it needs to do to look exceptional. And that is how you utilize classes' strengths to be able to bring them in something like an MDI situation. Now, of course, then they do insane MDI-sized pulls and are able to execute them perfectly as well, making sure that they get all the Staghorn kicks and make sure that no shields go off and stuff like that. But Obey Alliance looked really, really good here. PI me did start to start to catch back up towards the end, with some of their DPS, and I would say a little bit more efficient pulling multiple trash packs into Tredova and that kind of thing, and playing a little bit fewer of Prides. But at the same time, Obey Alliance really putting on a great show, pulling an insane pack into Tredova as well, and they were able to take the first map in Mistcaller Scythe by, I don't know, probably like 30-ish seconds if I had to guess about how long they were ahead. And it's off the back of that first boss. I really do feel like that.
Yeah, it was very convincing to be able to continue that lead and not really stumble along the rest of the dungeon, going to show how well they've been practicing up on it. So turning our focus over to the other side, what are some of the things that you want to see, Xyro, going into this one?
I want to see what people think the most efficient trash routing is. I've seen a lot of different ideas on live, especially on high push keys, but none of them are really conducive to speedrunning. Now, I think the thing that people don't really do in live keys, which can be done in the MDI, is mass pull the Night Fae area. Now, of course, I don't think we'll be able to see that too much because we're in this bolstering setting right now. But if we didn't have bolstering, I think that's one of the best places and most efficient places to get as much count as possible. And then you can do things like completely skip all of the Hakar wing and not have to deal with any of that trash, because that trash is probably the worst in the instance.
Yeah, especially when we have to deal with bolstering and like the constant mismatch of health that a lot of these enemies have going into Hakar. And it seems like the Ardenweald zone, that little Ardenweald stretch where there's tons of trash density, kind of offers a lot of flexibility for teams to be able to make up quite a bit of percent. So let's see what these guys have in store for us as game number 2 between Obey Alliance and PI Me gets underway.
The other side, another one of these beautiful zones here. You've got a little bit of the Ardenweald, but then also we got a little bit of a flashback to Mechagon and even to Zul'Gurub here through the different wings. Very, very cool place to go. One of the longer dungeons as well in the expansion. Ooh, they forgot to pick up the quest at the start there. You can get a little bit of anima if you go and do that quest from the Tiki thing that's floating over on the side there. So that's an early mistake here for both teams, as Obey Alliance and PI Me both going off on a fairly similar pull here, pulling those first two mobs down into the big pack here at the bottom of the stairs. Bloodlust committed by neither team, though. They're going to save that potentially for the next pull.
Oh, I think you for sure use that on Hakar, or maybe, like you said, you maybe use it on this pull with no cooldowns, but in this tyrannical setting, not using Bloodlust on the bosses seems pretty weird to me. But we'll learn pretty quickly what they plan on doing. I don't think they'll need Bloodlust here. Looks like Shape has his Combust back off cooldown very shortly here, so they shouldn't need it here. But even so, yeah,
skip
no,
vibes.
we're just going to go completely. We're going to go completely all the way to the end of this hall, if I had to guess.
So the question is, are they going to try and get to 20%? And if they do, I think that just skipping that pack and then doing the rest of this trash will allow them to pride onto Hakar. And I think that prideful onto Hakar is a pretty valuable thing to do because of the fact that it's a boss that scales so much up in time. If you can't kill the boss in the first like 45 seconds or so, you start getting these blood barriers. They start adding a lot of extra health to the thing. Then you got another blood barrier with even more health. And so there's a real incentive to front load as much damage as you can and to shave a little bit extra time off, because that can be really, those rewards can really compound if you end up skipping some blood barriers. And I think that's what Obey Alliance is up to here, as we see large pull coming out from PI Me as well, potentially slightly even larger pull in the Hakar wing as well.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like you could pull as much of this as possible and then use that Night Fae urn on the side in order to stun everything.
That's exactly what's happened, yeah.
And it looks like they're able to burn everything down before having to worry about any of those major heal casts from the priests and the hexers. So pretty cool strategy coming out from PI. I mean, this is kind of the thing that Dr. J and his team have been known for, is going for these kind of crazy, insane pulls. And look how it's paying off for them. First Pride already spawned. Mini has gone down, but they'll be able to battle res him. It's a little unfortunate that they have to commit that early on in the dungeon, though.
Yeah, they need actually somebody to go and successfully cast that battle res. It's going to be difficult to do, though, in the middle of this prideful combat that they are in. And actually, they already used a battle res as well, so they don't even have one available here for Mini. And no easy way to drop combat, no way for Mini to easily skip back to here, it doesn't look like. Although maybe he could have released right when he died and gotten back in time. Looks like at this point they are committed to their strategy. Oh no, Rentari goes down on the side of PI Me as well.
It looks like the play for them is that Rentari pulled the Prideful as far away as he possibly could, while the rest of the team got a Shadow Meld off and tried to get a res onto Mini, and then they should be able to get Rentari once they go into the boss room and he death skips back. That looks like it's what the play is, and there goes the mass res, so it looks like it's pulled off. It's barely pulled off for them. They're in the boss room. They just want to have that Prideful buff to deal with the boss.
Interesting. So we thought it was a good pull for them that almost worked out very well, but it turns out that the way that ended up going at the end, it might end up costing them. Might still be better than what Obey Alliance did, though. Obey Alliance took 2 pulls to do this corridor compared to the 3. They are still working on that manifestation of pride, but they will be rewarded with a prideful buff going into Hakar. Let's see if they're able to use that to claw back some of that time that they lost to PI Me doing this haul in fewer pulls.
Yeah, fortunately, because of the Shadow Melds, they got away with only 2 deaths, so I mean, making the best of a bad situation for them there, of course. But interesting thing here, Bloodlust not being popped for PI Me on this first boss Hakar here. I wonder if that's just if they just forgot to hit it because of that chaos that just happened to them? No, it's just
looks like they're firing it now. So perhaps they were waiting for cooldowns to be up. Looks like Xuen was just used, and there will be a combustion in this window. And I think there's the dark transformation as well for PI Me on the small screen. Meanwhile, on the big screen, Lust popped directly on pull here. Obey Alliance has all their cooldowns basically available. Chompy going to save a little bit, but should still be able to get them during the Bloodlust time here. Does need to get away from the boss a little bit. They have to handle this quaking as well, but you can see they have been nuking Hakar here. Hakar already down to 50% for them. On the side of PI Me, though, it is still dramatically lower at 20%, and it is dying quickly. Hopefully they're able to avoid the next Blood Barrier cast. Those Blood Barriers get increasingly large as this fight goes on, and there are more ads for it to hit. When the Blood Barrier hits one of those ads that's still up, or one of the ones that's reanimated, it gets very, very, very large. As you can see here on the side of Obey Alliance, that cast has just gone out, and Hakar is quite healthy at this 30%. Okay, they're able to break through the shield nicely, though. Getting it to 30% before the Blood Barrier cast is actually pretty relevant. It enables the Searing Touch from Shape if he's running that, which lets him do a little bit more damage and be a little bit more mobile in the execute phase, although it does hurt the refarming of the Combust. through the kindling
Ooh,
talent.
this is going to be close here. He's at 100 energy here. If he gets this blood barrier off, he does get it off. They're going to have to burn through that blood barrier, even though the boss is at 3%. That's really unfortunate. And you can see they even tried to mitigate it by using some immunities. It makes the barrier a little bit smaller because of the way the spell works. But still, they're going to have to burn through all of the shield on the players they hit, plus all of the Sons of Akar that are available, and it just costs them like 20 or so seconds. That being said, PIME does still have to skip past all of this trash that they did not kill, and they will not have their Shadow Melds available for anything that they might want to do in the Mana Storm's Mechagon area, whereas Obey Alliance will. So we're going to have to see how that works out for them coming up.
Looks like PIME is actually going to now be pulling the pack that they previously skipped to facilitate better lust timing. Mobs got shackled and I think imprisoned, or not imprisoned, but paralyzed, and then got pulled in. So I'm not sure what the idea was there. Maybe that was to use as a pseudo interrupt on those raptors. When they got pulled, something got sent flying by the frontal as well there, but it looks like it was just a pet, so not a big deal. Some of the Army of the Dead minions, perhaps. As PIME, you can see Rentari is under a lot of pressure here, dropping very low on health there. Does already have Cheat Death through Last Resort procced, so that's not available for him. Meanwhile, on the side of Obey Alliance, the same pull is coming out. Skylark in a lot of a healthier position with that Cheat Death still available, choosing to kite a little bit more early in order to preserve that as well. The Enraged Spirit is now the next order of business here for PIME. Let's see what they are going to do with this. A common strategy, if possible, is to pull it onto the nearby Night Fae urn and then use that urn to interrupt the Rage cast, which does a lot of group-wide damage. There's the Rage cast, and you can see the urn being opened by Dr. J, and that is going to stun for 10 seconds the Enraged Spirit, which is a tremendous difficulty decrease of a very hard mob that's only available if you do have a member of the Night Fae Covenant in your group.
And it's really important to time that Night Fae urn properly. If you stun the Rage before a tick of that Rage damage goes off, it'll just recast it. So you need to make sure that it gets stunned only after your group takes at least one tick of damage. I think they took 2 ticks of damage there, which, you'll take that every time, and it's a pretty good execution there. But there's a little bit more nuance to that click than it looks.
Dr. J is going to invis skip here rather than doing a meld skip because their meld was actually still on cooldown at the time across the group for PIME, and they will now be using a meld skip, presumably. I imagine that the way this dungeon is oriented, they are going to try and get most of their count from that Ardenweald wing, where everything is kind of, you could potentially pull it all at the same time. Whereas in this area, besides this pull, there's a lot of mobs that are not too pleasant to pull at the same time as each other, and you'd maybe rather skip with the Shadow Meld ability.
And it looks like everyone's staying pretty close into melee range so they can kind of split the difference of those discharge casts from the clients that do a lot of just damage to anyone in melee range. Pretty good strat from them. Usually your tank is the one just getting clobbered by them, but with this melee comp, they shouldn't be too big of an issue for them. Also, the Tyrannical makes it not that bad either. But yeah, all of the trash in this wing is pretty difficult. There's a lot of casts that they have to make sure they're interrupting, especially when they get to this next section with all of the lubricators. And if anything's done improperly here, they can set themselves behind pretty easily.
Yeah, I think they actually have engineering. Yeah, they do have engineering on the tournament realm, which means that they can use the little console to the left as you walk into that room, which pauses the slime flow. And they are now going to run through with their invis pots. They need to be careful to not go too far forward yet, though, because that will aggro these oils. And so they now pull those in with the lubricator, and they will be killing these 4 mobs. A very interrupt-heavy pull, but you can see the Sigil of Silence comes out from Rentari, which is going to do a great job of effectively being like 10 interrupts on this pull.
Yeah, they have a ton of AoE CC in the group. The Sigil of Silence, the Leg Sweep, the Ring of Peace to knock some things back. You have your Dragon's Breath from your Mage. Ideally, with the Mage cooldown here, no damage should be going off for them, and you can see pretty much perfect execution there. Nobody gets hit by any of those essential oils. And the Shadow Melds still aren't off cooldown. Oh no, they are off cooldown for PIME, so they could opt to skip this Prideful if they wanted to, but it's very unsurprising that they're opting to kill it because the next boss has a lot of HP to chew through, and you want to have that extra damage amp to help you out.
Meanwhile, here you can see on the side of Obey Alliance, similarly, actually slightly different pathing to the dungeon. They decided to pull what PIME skipped earlier, the kind of guards outside in the Mueh'zala ring that guard the entrance to this wing. And that means that they have a little bit more count, but they're a little bit behind in terms of dungeon progression right now. So it's kind of going to be a question of whether the pulls that PIME does later to make up that count will be more or less time efficient than what Obey Alliance did. I kind of like PIME's position, though. in the dungeon so far. I think that their pathing has been very smart. And even with a pretty big mishap of a death leading into a minute-long pseudo-wipe situation, they've ended up really, really being impressively fast through here.
Yep, for sure. And I mean, skipping all those lubricators is pretty, I mean, it makes the most sense out of anything in the dungeon to skip, because if you do miss those casts, it's a big DPS loss. People in your group just have a random chance to miss their spells and abilities for a while. So definitely don't want to take any chance there, because that can get out of control quickly. Both teams opting for that, and Millhouse Mana Storm already getting low for PIME.
Yeah, this is a cool boss because both bosses have casts that they can do while they are inactive that allow you to crowd control the active boss, right? You can see here this little laser beam. If you line that up such that it overlaps with Maleficent Mana Storm, it'll stun her. And then, or with Millhouse Mana Storm rather, it'll stun him. And then when Maleficent is down, Millhouse will cast Shadow Fury if he's still alive, and that can be used to stun her. Particularly helpful against her chicken robot rain thing cast that otherwise can do quite a lot of damage and really close a lot of the room off to your group.
Yep, for sure. And you got to remember as well that this section of the boss, this Maleficent Mana Storm phase, is a tank buster. This does a lot of damage to your tank, especially if you let it stack up too much. So I wouldn't be surprised to see Rentari go ahead and kiting around the room once that bleed debuff gets high enough. I think he already committed his Kyrian pot to resetting it, or maybe he's just got some lucky dodges as well. But if that debuff gets too high, you can see some major damage going off on the tanks here.
Yeah, those bleed stacks are really, really nasty. Here it is, though. The Shadow Fury goes on Dr. J. It's going to stun him, but it's also going to stun Maleficent, send her back up to the rafters, and they will now be finishing off Millhouse and then finishing off Maleficent. Very, very cleanly executed, I'd say, so far by PI. Most of these mechanics have been landing exactly as intended, as they need to soak these power-infusing crystals before they actually reach the boss. Similar to Galvazed back in Temple of Centralis last expansion. Want to make sure that those lines do not make it to the boss in order to avoid it powering up too much, as Mini unfortunately goes down for PI.
I didn't quite see what he went down to there. Was it just dying to power crystal damage? I completely missed that. Really unfortunate. That being said, the boss is pretty much already dead, so they might not need to commit the battle res. This next Maleficent phase might take quite a while, especially with Millhouse already dead. They won't have those Shadow Furies available. So if things go horribly wrong here, they might actually have to deal with an aerial rocket chicken barrage with no stun, but hopefully they can get the boss down before that. Dr. J does have the Combust available, but he's not committing it because I think they'll be able to get it down before that happens.
Yeah, the boss actually ends at 10% as well. You don't actually kill this boss, so because of that, they're actually fairly close to this one being done. I don't think they're in too much danger, but it was certainly close. If Mini had died a little bit earlier, they might have been in this fight for a lot longer. They are able to escape, though. As Maleficent reaches 10%, they will be drawing back the mojo so they can empower Bwansamdi with it later.
Ooh, Dr. J with a little time skip there, making sure he was on top of the hole before getting the mojo drawn. Yep, little time save. If everyone in the group did that, looking at maybe a 5 to 10 second time save. Pretty smart play from him there.
A little bit risky on a Quaking week, though, of course, if you get the Quaking time. They were a little bit off the timer being bad, but potentially you can get in a lot of trouble when you're casting that draw mojo after killing a boss if you are all stacked on top of each other.
Mini was not AFK there, by the way, chat. He was waiting for one of his teams to come outside and get on the staircase to unlock the next checkpoint so that when he released, he came right outside instead of respawning at the boss. So a little bit of a time save for him there as well, and they're able to get right into this next pack that they skipped earlier on with the Combust available, just burning it down quickly.
Dr. J zoned off of his first Rune of Power as a result of those two Warlords both targeting near the area. That is unfortunate for him. He's still doing respectable 17k DPS, though. Nothing too shabby there for the Fire Mage. Of course, wow, the damage is very high across the entire team of PI. Look at the damage, not just of their other DPS players, but of Rentari on that Kyrian Demon Hunter with those double potency conduits, the Echoing Decree and the Growing Inferno, just contributing so much damage for a spec that is already quite high damage.
Important to mention as well that neither of these teams is running a Soothe, so whenever these Warlords cast their Undying Rage, they have no way of killing them off for 15 seconds. They just have to wait for that debuff to go away. And there you go, it goes down just now, and they're going to go instantly into this Rage, which again, the Combust is available for.
Yeah, this time they don't have a Night Fae Urn available to stun its Rage cast, so they are going to just have to live through it unless they decide to pull this all the way up onto the next platform where there is one such thing. Alter Time is going to be used by Dr. J. Alter's at about 90% health. Alter Time is a very potent defensive option for mages this expansion. It needs to be used carefully, right? You need to make sure that you're not, pressing it like you would a normal defensive when you start taking damage. You need to press it before you start taking too much damage. And that little shift in thought process is actually very difficult to internalize, but when it's done well, it can heal you for your whole health bar potentially.
Yeah, and I mean, a really good option that a lot of players just forget about using sometimes is if you're at like 60%, you're not sure if you want to pop that alter time, just health potion and then instantly alter time to give yourself a full health alter time. It can save your life in so many situations. Mage this expansion is actually just one of the most disgusting classes. In addition to still doing insane damage, they just got 2 insane defensive cooldowns. Not only do they have alter time, which we've already talked about being OP, but mirror images is a 20-second damage reduction, which can last for up to 40 seconds as long as your mirror images are still alive. I don't know why they decided to give Mage 2 ridiculous personal cooldowns, but hey, there you go.
Yeah, the Mage, particularly in this setting as well, it shines so much with just the way that combustion operates. How bursty it is in a setting like this that is really all about that burst damage, and the fact that it scales up fantastically into AoE as long as you're flame striking, which you are as of right now. Obey Alliance. Actually, yeah, these two teams are neck and neck here on the timer. We have both teams making their way into the Ardenweald wing with almost the exact same count. So everything has really evened out over the last few minutes as teams have kind of been killing trash packs in slightly different orders. Things have been going a little bit wrong in a couple of spots, but for the most part, the plan has been working for both these teams. And Obey Alliance are actually now slightly ahead on the timer. Not by a huge amount, though.
I would venture to say very far ahead, especially since they're already dealing with their first trash pack. And you got to remember, they have that 4-death advantage. PIME had some issues earlier on in the dungeon, so the 20-second extra time on the board for them. And yeah, they're already almost an entire trash pack ahead. So I would say that Obey Alliance has somehow taken the lead here, even after being behind on the Mana Storm twins. I mean, they just came out of nowhere, I feel like, here.
Well, they had already killed that trash pack at the bottom of the stairs, so they were able to recoup that time. That was when we saw that in their dungeon progression. And yeah, the Mana Storms was a tough fight for PIME because Mini was dead for the last 30% of it. And that certainly is costly for a team's timer. However, you can see both teams are working on pulls here pretty quickly. PIME has caught up rather quickly to this area of the dungeon. They are moving through the dungeon pretty quickly, as Obey Alliance are also working in this area. There is a Night Fae urn available in this section of the dungeon, but there are some trash mobs you have to make sure you pull if you want to use it. Otherwise, it will pull them for you. And that's something that you rarely wish to do. Let's see what they decide to do here, as we have 71% count, 72% for Obey Alliance. A large pull, it looks like, is going to be the order of the day. Skylark running around, grabbing a bunch of mobs. It's going to include that dragon. And this dragon is notably stunnable with the Night Fae urn, so perhaps that is what they are up to here. They have a Night Fae player that is not their mage in the form of that Disciplined Priest, so perhaps they will opt to have the priest pop that urn if it wasn't already used. Whereas PIME only has the one Fae player. Their priest is playing Kyrian, so that is a difference in Covenant choice. Along with the difference, I think, yes, their Death Knights are also playing different Covenants. So even though we see the same specs on these teams, we actually have only 60% of the same Covenants and 40% divergence.
Yeah, and that Night Fae urn has still not been used. They're going to use it at some point. There's no major reason not to. But I'd imagine they're going to do it with the Matriarch pull down below right afterwards. I mean, it just wouldn't make sense not to use it. It's a free A-second stun, keep everything in your mage's flame patch during combust, making sure that everything's in your DK's D&D. It makes the pull so much easier, so we'll probably see that being used to clear up pretty much the rest of their trash percentage here pretty soon.
Yeah, first they're going to make sure they get this Pride buff, and the combination of a Pride buff and a Night Fae urn can be used to make a massive, impossible-seeming pull quite doable. You have a huge amount of burst damage, and you have the ability to prevent the mobs from killing you while you are deploying your burst. And really crucially, prevent the mobs from forcing you to move or interrupt or use a crowd control global, right? If your mage just gets to pop their combustion and dump it into the mobs with a damage increase and doesn't have to cast any Dragon's Breath, doesn't have to interrupt anything, doesn't have to spell steal anything, that's the sort of thing that really multiplies your damage to the next level and makes it possible to get a really huge pull done successfully.
And there's the prideful buff that'll be on them for the next minute. Let's see what they end up planning for this Night Fae. And I'm excited for this because they can probably pull this entire room. There's one half of it, and if I'm not mistaken, Skylark will probably be going and pulling the rest of those, plus the Matriarch in the corner. And, well, maybe not the Matriarch, actually, because it's going to have more HP, and it'll be an issue for bolstering. It looks like they have everything but the Matriarch, and they're pulling it into a Ring of Frost, so they get perfect timing on the Sun here, too. Man, watch this Trashback melt.
Yeah, these mobs are all exactly identical, so they can just fully AoE here and kill all of them right around the same time, except for Chompy, who can't deal damage to the 6th target. But other than that, they are killing all of these very quickly, as Chompy is unfortunately 4th place in the damage meters there for Obey Alliance. Not to worry, though. One of them a little bit high on health, but they are doing a great job here of just melting, what was that, 12% trash in a single pull. All of these Blade Beaks all at once. And yes, that is really, really, really well played.
Yeah,
sometimes it's
pretty textbook.
Yeah. I was going to say, sometimes it's kind of easy to forget that bolstering is active when you watch MDI teams play, right? You can kind of be like, oh yeah, this dungeon's looking pretty clean, because they do such a good job of playing around it. And when you play around it, it's not too visible, but there's actually such an intense amount of skill being deployed to make it look that easy.
I mean, I actually imagine that part of the reason the Monk decided to not do damage there is because they are target capped and would just mess with the bolstering, right? So just smart heads up play, and then he can actually just pop his cooldowns on this AoE pack while the DK isn't really able to use his cooldowns. So just smart cooldown allocation and understanding of how bolstering mechanics work from them.
We actually have a difference here in pulls, as Obey Alliance have gone straight into the boss here at 94% trash count, whereas PI are going to get to their 100%, I believe, on that pull that they were up to. Obey Alliance dropping down some world markers. The world markers are perhaps being used to identify who's going to go on which of these swirlies in order to prevent taking damage from that big explosion. Also perhaps being used to manage the Arcane Lightning debuff. Little known debuff on this fight, particularly if you don't do particularly high keys, but as you start getting to the keys in this 18 level, the Arcane Lightning does huge amounts of damage. That's why the Anti-Magic Zone is actually down right now. It zaps between the player who has it and the closest player, and it persists the entire fight, jumping between the players. And you really want to make sure you're managing it. You can see Skylark here is having it, and then he's dropping it off on alternating between the two melee players. And stacking up a bunch of stacks of that debuff on himself that increase the damage it does. But as a tank, you can really survive quite high stacks. You just want to make sure you're not zapping the same DPS player twice with it.
For sure. I mean, usually just like a rotation of 3 players will do the trick, kind of like on Galvast back in last expansion. But sometimes you need to just, get a 4th player, and so it's something that you kind of have to do on the fly. And like you mentioned, there are some issues whenever the explosive contrivances goes off, and you really need to make sure that the next player needs to be as close to you as possible. So yeah, just you're seeing the world marker spam just to make sure everyone knows exactly where they need to be for these AoE casts from the boss when they go up in the air, like right now.
Yeah, you can see we have, what is this? There are only 8 total world markers available. It looks like 6 of them are down here for Obey Alliance. We'll have to see where they decide to use their other 2 world markers. Now a very limited resource for them.
Yep, for sure. A little bit of a different strategy coming out from PI as well. We already talked about this, but they ended up dealing with that final Pride, and they have it available right now while they're on the dealer himself. The Bloodlust is also pop, so they'll be getting through this boss pretty quickly, but I mean, they pretty much are an entire boss behind now, even though they already have dealt with that last 6%. I'm really interested to see what the plan is for Obey Alliance here, because they aren't getting the benefits of that final Prideful, so I'd imagine they're going to be shadow melding it off.
Obey Alliance is not going to be taking the portal back.
Ooh.
They are walking around here, and potentially they are going to get their Pride, and then maybe they'll use the portal to skip the Pride and get back to Mueh'zala or something. Let's see what they are up to, as PI, of course, finishing off this dealer Xy'exa boss that is one of the nastier bosses, kind of surprisingly, because of just how much damage is going out as the Keystone level goes up. And
now, I'm interested.
They're catching up.
They are definitely catching up. This is going to be a lot closer than I thought it was based off of the previous routing. I felt like Obey Alliance's routing in this dungeon was definitely a lot better, but it's kind of questionable at this point. Unless they somehow find a way to use this Prideful on the last boss, I don't really see what the advantage of this style of polling is.
So I think what this lets them do is it lets them skip the Pride easily, but maybe there's a way that maybe it'll port to them if they all jump in this fast enough. So maybe they're still in combat right now while they're in the vehicle, and they can actually bring the Pride onto this boss. I don't know how valuable that would be, because this isn't really a boss, Mueh'zala, that benefits all that much from having Pride on full for. But maybe if you can cleave it down somehow, I don't know. I'm curious to see exactly what they're going to do, because there's definitely I'm not 100% sure what the plan is yet, as Piami going for a much more traditional path. Igloo has unfortunately died for them. We'll be able to release once they get back over the stairs, though, and pretty quickly join them on Mueh'zala. Important, as you can see, Mini did earlier, Igloo also going to be holding that release spirit button. And yeah, these teams are neck and neck right now. Both teams at 100% count. Both teams just making sure that they can do this boss fight as cleanly as possible.
The manifestation is next to the boss for Obey Alliance here.
Okay.
They did not hit Shadow Meld, and if you do not Shadow Meld or drop aggro with any of that trash in the Ardenweald ring, it will eventually snap to you. But the Shadow Meld looks like it is just now finally coming out from Skylark, so it looks like they're just planning on skipping it altogether, which is definitely a little bit of a weird way to do it.
40
and
goes
people
down.
are dying for both teams.
It seems like 40's death was probably not part of the plan here for Obey Alliance.
Oh. No, this manifestation was the fourth one from earlier.
Okay.
No, the third one from when they hit 60% count. So they need to pull this up to the top of the stairs, get out of combat with it. Man, this is unfortunate for both teams.
It'll leash back to where it lived, right? Or does it stay where it?
Yeah, it'll
drops
leash back.
combat?
So they just have to deal with it. But what is going wrong? What did PI do to be able to not deal with that manifestation that Obey Alliance isn't doing?
Maybe they spawned it further up. When the manifestation spawns, it spawns based on where your players
Yeah.
are. So if you make sure you're a little bit further up, you can potentially avoid that being a problem. However, Obey Alliance, even though they're pulling Mueh'zala later, they are going to have the prideful buff for this boss. This is a boss that's a fairly static timer in that it casts the shadow reality that sends you to each of the 4 different platforms at a fixed time in the fight. And if you have enough damage, you then are killing those 4 mobs, sending 1 DPS player to each platform, and the healer and tank generally to the same platform as each other. And then you are unloading onto the boss with a huge haste buff from doing that. And if that all works out well, the boss dies in 1 cast of that. However, it's an 18 tyrannical keystone. That is everything dying, everything going cleanly is not a guarantee at all. And I would say Piami has a pretty solid chance of being able to make that work. But if it doesn't, Obey Alliance is certainly close enough to take the game back if in that case.
Yeah, I mean, the guys to keep an eye on for sure are the people that we're looking at for PI right now. The tank and healer combo are going to have the biggest issue dealing with their trash mob. The other 3 DPS players can all just use their cooldowns to go ahead and one-shot their mob. Probably, yeah, you'll probably just see the cooldowns all being used there. But yeah, the tank and the healer are the ones that usually have the most issues. So if they're able to get theirs down and click the totem, the rest shouldn't have any issues too. And it looks like Rentari's clicking that totem right now.
Yeah, so these teams are just about 20 seconds or so away from each other in terms of where they are right now. You can see on the small screen, it's going to be Piami who gets the first crack at getting Mueh'zala all the way down to 10% health here. Looks like all their players have successfully channeled on their totems. The question is if any of them have any damage left in the tank here to try and finish the boss here, as we can just like skip back. Okay, yeah, so here we are with Rentari on Piami. They are going to get Mueh'zala down to 16%. They actually have quite a lot of health to still burn through as it ticks down to 15. They need to get it to 10. I think it's 10.4% when this boss ends. So they have a lot of damage left to do here. But Dr. J is combusting. I think they will be able to do this before they get to the next Shadow Realities cast.
And the thing to remember here as well is that there is still a 20-second time difference on the board. So even though Obey Alliance is 2% behind, that 20 seconds is very close to being able to make up for it. So it could be really close here at the end.
Yes, this is going to come right down to the wire because I do think Piami is going to kill this boss first in terms of what time they kill it. But the question of those 4 deaths, adding an extra 20 seconds that separates these teams, I believe that's going to be enough for Obey Alliance to do it. Obey Alliance has actually been closing the gap on the boss's health as well. So I think that as long as we can avoid a Shattered Realities cast on both teams, that's the question. Are we going to see a Shattered Realities cast? Are we going to have to wait a little bit longer for either team? Because I believe that's what he does, even if all 4 of the ads are dead. But maybe I'm mistaken on that.
No, he doesn't cast it anymore. Once all 4 ads are dead, he never casts it again, and you stay in this phase entirely until the boss dies. But it is down for Piami. 20 seconds on the board for Obey Alliance, and their boss is still at 11%. They need to get through this last percentage of the boss within the next 9 seconds. Otherwise, we're going to be going to a game 3. Can Obey Alliance pull it off? 3 seconds left on the board.
There it is.
They're able to get it down.
Oh my goodness. Obey Alliance, just by the skin of their teeth, 3 seconds ahead of their opponents, and they take the 2-0 sweep, pushing themselves into the upper bracket for tomorrow. Wow. That was amazing to see there, Settles.
Oh my goodness. Dude, that whole entire